Now, there are different kinds of stubbornness in this world. There is the kind that keeps a man at the card table long past midnight, chasing money already lost. And there is the kind that puts a widow in knee-deep snow before dawn, talking to a husband who ain't ever coming home. I told you this cedar wouldn't hold past January, Tom. Martha Yates wrapped at both hands around the fence post and pulled. The wood didn't budge, frozen solid into ground that hadn't thawed since November. The post leaned at an angle no amount of cursing could correct. She braced her boots against the snowpack, leaned back with everything she had, and felt the wire bite through her cloth wrappings into the raw meat of her palms. She didn't cry out. She'd stopped doing that somewhere around Christmas. February in Fort Collins meant a cold that settled into your teeth and stayed. The rangeland stretched white and silent in every direction, broken only by fence lines that winter kept snapping like thread. 60 acres of it belonged to Martha, or rather, had belonged to Tom Yates, who'd built every post and strung every wire with hands that knew the difference between a dream and a deed. Tom had been gone since October. 4 months. Felt like 4 years. Martha freed one hand and flexed her fingers. The cloth wrapping had soaked through again. Snow and something darker underneath. Her knuckles were swollen past recognition. The cracks between her fingers had stopped healing weeks ago, opening fresh each morning when she gripped the first post. She surveyed what lay ahead. 3 more sections down since last Tuesday. Wire sagging between posts that leaned like tired old men in a windstorm. Beyond the breaks, coyote tracks crossed freely onto her land. Bold as you please. Folks in town had offered to buy her out. Lyle Patterson came by in November with a number that would have been insulting even if she'd been willing. 2 others followed. Martha thanked each one, served them coffee, and showed them the door. This land was Tom's promise made real. Every post he'd driven was a word he'd spoken to her. Stay, build, grow, live. She would not sell his words to men who'd plow them under for cattle grass. She hauled the wire cutters from her belt and crouched beside the broken section. Across the boundary to the east, Caleb Dunning's spread ran to the horizon. 3,000 acres of prime grassland, fences straight as a plumb line, maintained by a crew of men who earned more in a month than Martha spent in a year. She turned away from it, bent to her work. By the time she dragged herself inside that evening, the post she'd fought all morning had shifted again. Martha stood in the doorway watching it lean, hands throbbing, breath white in the dark air. She closed her eyes, opened them, pulled the door shut and went to heat water for her hands. Tomorrow she'd start again. Same as every morning since Tom left her with 60 acres of love and a fence line that wouldn't hold. Caleb Dunning had his coffee same time every morning, 5:15, black, strong enough to float a horseshoe. He drank it standing at the kitchen window because the chair felt wrong when a man had something on his mind. What he had on his mind was Martha Yates. He could see her lamplight if he looked southwest, a small gold flicker moving across her property like a firefly that didn't know when to quit. She'd be out there already, hauling posts, stringing wire, bleeding into snow that didn't care about her promises. Patterson offered her 40 cents an acre last month, said Hector, his foreman, scraping eggs onto a tin plate at the stove. She run him off polite as Sunday church. I know. Macaulay tried too, and that Miller fella from Loveland. I know that too. Hector set the plate down and looked at Caleb with the directness of a man who'd worked 20 years earning the right to speak plain. You've been watching her from that window every morning for 3 weeks, boss. Ain't like you to stand still this long. Caleb sipped his coffee and said nothing. He had 6 hands on payroll, a barn stacked with cedar posts, and enough wire to fence the whole county twice over. He also had his own memories of pride nearly killing him. The year Eleanor died. He'd run this ranch alone for 5 months before Hector found him collapsed in the south pasture, dehydrated and half delirious, Too stubborn to admit a widower couldn't work 3,000 acres on fury and grief, Hector had picked him up, driven him home, and hired the first 3 hands without asking permission. That was 12 years ago. Caleb still owed him for it. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, walked to the barn, and stood looking at his stacked posts, his coiled wire, his 6 hands who'd spend the day mending fence that didn't need mending. 3,000 acres, every inch maintained, and next door, 60 acres falling apart under a woman too proud to let a neighbor lift a hammer. He settled his horse and rode the eastern line. His side, not hers. The fence was perfect, every post plumb, every wire taut. He rode it anyway, because riding was easier than standing at a window watching someone make the same mistake he'd nearly died from. When he returned, Hector was waiting by the barn. "Snow ain't gonna wait for her pride to thaw, boss." Caleb said nothing. But he didn't ride the boundary that afternoon. He rode toward town instead. The water in the basin had gone pink. Martha sat at the kitchen table soaking her hands by lamplight, watching the blood thread outward like smoke from a dying fire. The cracks ran deep now across her knuckles, between her fingers, along the heel of each palm where the wire pressed hardest. Above the fireplace, Tom's initials stared back at her from the mantel beam. T. Y. 1884. He'd carved them the day they finished the cabin, standing on a chair with his good knife while Martha held the lamp and laughed at his crooked Y. She hadn't been there when he died. That was the part nobody talked about and everybody knew. October 7th, a horse threw him on the north pasture. She'd been in town buying flour, came home to a dead man and 60 acres of promises she'd made to a living one. At his grave, she'd said one thing: "The land stands. Tom, I swear it." So every morning she went out. Every morning she hauled cedar and wire through snow that came up past her knees. Every morning she talked to him while she worked, because the sound of her own voice was the only thing that proved she was still breathing. A crash from outside tore through the silence. Martha was on her feet before the echo died, pulling her coat on, shoving through the door into blue-black cold. The whole east section, down. 4 posts snapped at the base, wire coiled in the snow like dead snakes. Ice weight, too much for cedar that had already survived 3 winters past its strength. She walked to the edge of the collapse. The gap was wide enough to drive a wagon through. The Rockies rose behind it, massive and indifferent, and the wind came through that gap like it owned the place now. Martha grabbed the nearest broken post and tried to drag it upright. It came apart in her hands, the wood wet and rotten at the core. She grabbed the next one. Same. She dropped to her knees in the snow, fingers clawing at wire and splinters, pulling, twisting, trying to force something upright in a gap that kept swallowing everything she gave it. She stopped, knelt there, breathing hard, hands burning, staring at the wreckage. Then she stood, brushed the snow off her knees, walked inside, and sat down at the table with her jaw set and her fists clenched against the wood so hard her knuckles went white. "I can do this, Tom." The fire popped. No answer came. And outside, the gap stayed open. Martha was worse than the last time he'd seen her. Caleb noticed it the moment he rounded her barn on Tuesday morning, following the shared boundary line under pretense of checking drainage. She was halfway across the north pasture carrying a post on her shoulder, and the way she moved told him everything. Slower, listing to the right, stopping every 20 yards to shift the weight because her hands couldn't grip. She saw him and set the post down carefully, straightened her back, lifted her chin. "Mr. Dunning?" "Mornin', Mrs. Yates." They stood on opposite sides of the collapsed east section. Wind pushed snow between them in low white sheets. The gap was worse up close. 4 posts shattered, wire everywhere, and beyond it the rest of her fence line sagging like a clothesline in rain. "Saw this section come down from my ridge," he said. "That's more work than a month of Sundays." It's more work than a week, she said, but I've got till spring. Martha. He dropped the formality without thinking. I got posts stacking up with nothing to do. Wire, too, and hands who'd welcome honest work. Let me send. I appreciate that, Caleb, truly. She picked up the post, held it against her shoulder. But if I start taking help every time the wind blows something down, I might as well let Patterson write his check. That ain't the same thing, and you know it. She almost smiled. Maybe not, but it feels the same from where I'm standing. He watched her carry the post toward the gap, watched her drop to her knees and start digging with a hand spade, the frozen ground giving up nothing. Her wrappings had soaked through again. Fresh blood on old cloth. You're the stubbornest woman in Larimer County, he said. Couldn't help it. She looked over her shoulder, and there it was, quick as a match strike, the ghost of who she'd been before October. Well, somebody's got to hold the title. Mr. Dunning, Lord knows you retired from it. He laughed, surprised himself. She turned back to her digging, and the smile faded from his face because he understood now. A small offer was just a small insult. This woman wasn't going to accept a couple of hands for an afternoon. She'd refuse anything that let her keep pretending she was fine. If he helped Martha Yates, it had to be something so big she couldn't politely step around it. Something that matched the size of her stubbornness with the stubbornness of his own. He rode home, unsaddled his horse, walked into the barn and stood looking at cedar posts stacked 8 feet high and began to count. Now, pride is a funny thing out on the frontier, keeps a lot of folks warm at night, but Lord, it don't cut the wind. After Caleb's visit, Martha worked harder. She didn't examine why. Something about his voice saying her name. Martha was like she was a person and not a cause. Something about the way he'd laughed when she called him stubborn. A sound so unexpected it had cracked something open she'd sealed shut in October. She hauled 4 posts that morning, got 2 in the ground. The 3rd split when she drove it, and the 4th she dropped in a drift because her fingers simply quit. She stood over it, breathing hard, flexing hands that wouldn't close all the way anymore. The wire was worse. She was stringing a section along the north line when the tension gave without warning. A snap like a rifle shot, the wire whipping past her face close enough to lift the hair from her temple. Martha stumbled backward into the snow and lay there staring at sky, heart slamming against her ribs. An inch to the left, that wire takes her eye. She got up, kept working, but her hands shook for the rest of the day, and not from cold. Thursday, 3 women from town came with a covered dish and gentle company. Ada Sullivan carried the pot. Clara Patterson brought biscuits. Young Ellen Marsh, the pastor's wife, brought a jar of honey and a smile that didn't ask for anything in return. You look thin, Martha, Ada said, setting plates on the table. Winter does that. Winter don't put those marks on your hands, dear, Ellen said softly. Martha tucked her hands beneath the table. They'll heal when spring comes. They ate together, and the warmth of women's voices filled the cabin in a way that lamplight couldn't. Martha let herself have it. She was proud, not heartless, but she heard what she wasn't supposed to hear. Ada, whispering to Clara by the door while Martha walked Ellen to her horse. The words carried on cold air the way words do when you're not meant to catch them. Caleb Dunning could have that fence right in 2 days flat. Whole property she's a fool to keep refusing. Martha pressed her lips together, said nothing, thanked them for the food, watched them ride toward town, stood alone in the silence they left behind. She looked down at her hands, looked east at her fence line, sagging and broken and patched with nothing but stubbornness and twine, looked at the gap in the east section that she'd been fighting for a week without gaining an inch. She wrapped fresh cloth around her palms, pulled on her coat, walked back out into the snow, but at the door, she paused, looked east, past her own fences, toward Caleb Dunning's land, just for a moment. Then she pulled her collar up and stepped into the cold. Caleb selected his man with the care of a man building something that mattered. Hector first, steady, quiet, respectful, the kind of man who'd tip his hat to a lady and keep his mouth shut about her business. Then James and Robert, the fence crew, fastest post setters in Larimer County, young Will, who could string wire in his sleep, old Dale, who'd been building fences since before Colorado was a state, and Miguel, who spoke little English but understood dignity in any language. 6 men, his best. He gathered them in the barn, lantern light throwing long shadows across the stacked posts. "We ain't going over there to rescue nobody. Mrs. Yates is a capable woman holding down 60 acres on her own. And any man among you who treats her like she ain't will answer to me. We're going as neighbors. That clear?" 6 nods, no questions. He ordered the wagon loaded, fresh cedar posts, enough to replace every weak section on her property. Wire. Good wire, what? Not the cheap stock that brittled in cold, tools, a spare maul, 2 extra diggers. He stood in the barn and watched his men stack the wagon until it groaned. And he thought about Eleanor, about the 5 months after she died when he tried to hold 3,000 acres together with his bare hands and his anger and his refusal to need anyone. About Hector finding him face down in the south pasture and not saying a word, just lifting him up and driving him home. He knew what pride cost. He'd paid the bill himself. Hector found him that evening, cinching the wagon tarp against overnight snow. The foreman leaned against the barn rail and watched him work. What if she says no again? Caleb pulled the rope tight. She might. And then I'll have loaded a wagon for nothing and earned the right to say I tried. Hector was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice as plain as fence wire, "You ain't rescuing her, boss. You're just being a neighbor." Caleb stopped. Let the words settle. Nodded once. That night, word moved through town the way it always did. Quiet, fast, like water finding cracks. Some said Caleb was sweet on the Yates widow. Others said he was a good man doing what good men do. A few said Martha would run him off same as she'd run off everyone else. Caleb didn't hear any of it. He was in bed by 8, awake by 4, and mounted by 5. Pre-dawn, 6 riders behind him, wagon wheels grinding frozen ground. They rode southwest toward Martha's 60 acres as the first light cracked the horizon like a thin gold line drawn with a careful hand. And here is the part of this story I want you to hold on to. Martha was out before the sun, same as every morning, same boots, same coat, same cloth-wrapped hands that hadn't known a painless morning since December. She was crouched beside the east section, the one that had beaten her for days, fighting a post into frozen ground with a maul she could barely lift. She was talking to Tom. "I know what you'd say." Her breath came in white bursts. "You'd say I'm being a fool, and maybe I am, but this is your fence, Tom, and I won't let it fall while I'm still." The maul slipped, caught her thumb against the post. She dropped it in the snow and pressed both hands to her chest, eyes stinging, jaw locked tight. Then she heard them. Hooves, not one horse. Many. The muffled thunder of riders crossing deep snow, and beneath it the low groan of heavy wagon wheels. Martha stood, turned east. Caleb Dunning rode toward her out of the morning light, sitting his bay gelding easy and straight. Behind him, 6 men on horseback, spread in a patient line. Behind them, a wagon stacked high with fresh cedar posts, pale and clean against the gray sky, and coil after coil of new wire glinting like silver in the early sun, enough to fence the whole property. Martha's breath stopped. Her mouth opened. The refusal was right there, sitting on her tongue where it always sat, polished smooth from months of use. I appreciate the kindness, but Caleb pulled up 10 feet from her. His men halted. The wagon creaked to a stop. Snow fell softly between them, fat flakes drifting through a silence so deep Martha could hear her own heartbeat. He looked at her hands, looked at the fallen post, looked at her face, and smiled. "Ma'am, being stubborn ain't the same as being strong. Let folks who admire you stand beside you." The silence lasted long enough for the snow to gather on Martha's shoulders. She looked at her hands. The cloth was dark with old blood, the fingers beneath swollen and cracked, the skin split in places that would scar. She looked at the E-section behind her, the gap she'd fought for a week, the wire that had nearly taken her eye, the cedar that kept splitting because it had given everything it had. She looked at Caleb's face, no pity, no charity, no transaction, just a neighbor on a cold morning, hat in his hands now, waiting. She nodded, one small nod. Something broke, not the fence. Something older than that, zizia, something she'd been building since October. Post by post, refusal by refusal, every polite no, another strand of wire wrapped tight across her own chest until she could barely breathe. Martha bent down, picked up the post she'd been fighting, walked it to the nearest rider, and held it out. "This one goes there." She pointed at the gap. 18 inches deep, and don't spare them all. This ground don't forgive half measures. The rider looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Martha. Then the rider grinned, took the post, and swung down from his horse. 7 pairs of hands went to work. Caleb had built 3,000 acres from nothing, fenced more miles than he could count, and managed crews through summers that melted iron and winters that froze it. He had never seen anyone work like Martha Yates. She didn't stand back and watch. She walked the line with them, dropping to her knees in the snow to hold a post steady while James drove it home, pointing to spots where the ground went rocky and the holes needed to go deeper, knowing by feel where Tom had set the original corners. 2 inches north, she told Robert, not even looking at the ground. Tom lined this section off that boulder. See the mark he chipped. Robert looked, found it, nodded with something close to reverence. On the second day, Old Dale was stringing the west line when Martha crouched beside him and watched his hands. He used a technique she hadn't seen, a double wrap at the post junction that distributed tension across 2 points instead of 1. She studied it in silence, then looked up at him. Tom never did it that way. Dale's weathered face creased. "No, ma'am, most folks don't, but it holds through ice better. Want me to show you?" Martha held out her hands. Dale placed the wire across her palms and guided her fingers through the wrap, patient and wordless. The way you teach someone who already understands the language and just needs a new word. When she finished the first junction, she ran her thumb across it and felt how the wire sat, balanced and tight, the tension shared instead of concentrated. She looked at the old man for a long moment. "Much obliged, Mr. Dale." "Yes, ma'am." Caleb watched from 3 posts down and said nothing. But he understood something he'd only guessed at before. Martha hadn't been failing. She'd been doing everything right, everything Tom had taught her. She just couldn't be in 6 places at once. The days found their rhythm. Posts driven into frozen earth, wire singing taut against the Rockies, the ring of malls echoing off the mountains. Martha and Caleb fell into a pattern without discussing it. She positioned the post, he swung the maul, she pulled the wire, he anchored it. Their hands passed tools back and forth with the ease of people who understood each other's silence. Small moments gathered like snowfall. Martha laughing when Will set a post so crooked that old Dale just stood there and stared at it until Will pulled it out himself. Ears red. Caleb handing Martha the water dipper and their fingers touching on the handle. A half-second of warmth that neither mentioned and neither forgot. Hector catching Caleb's eye across the line and nodding once. By the 12th, the north and east lines stood new and true. By the 13th, the south and west followed, every section replaced, every wire strung, every gap closed. The crew packed their tools as the sun dropped behind the mountains. They tipped their hats to Martha one by one. She shook each man's hand, looking him in the eye, and thanked him by name. When they'd gone, Martha stood at the center of her property and turned a slow circle. 60 acres. Every fence line straight, pale cedar bright against the snow. She touched the nearest post, ran her fingers across it. Caleb lingered, holding his horse's reins, waiting. Martha looked at him. Her hands, still wrapped, still healing, hung steady at her sides. "You'll come for coffee tomorrow?" she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am, I believe I will." Valentine's Day came to Fort Collins the way most days came, cold, quiet. The mountains still holding last night's snow like something precious they weren't ready to share. Martha set 2 chairs on the porch. She dragged them from the kitchen herself, positioned them facing southwest where the view opened up to the full span of the Rockies. She set a small table between them, put out 2 cups, poured coffee from the pot she'd brewed strong enough to float a horseshoe, the way Tom used to make it, the way she'd noticed Caleb liked it too. Then she sat down and waited. She'd done something that morning she hadn't done since October. She'd walked the entire fence line, not to mend it, not to check for breaks, but simply to see it, to walk beside 60 acres of new cedar and tight wire and feel the solid fact of it beneath her fingertips. At the east section, where the collapse had been, she stopped and pressed her palm flat against a post, feeling the wood, cold and smooth and strong. And something inside her chest that had been clenched for months quietly opened. "I didn't let go of your dream, Tom. I just let someone help me hold it. It wasn't goodbye. It was something quieter. A gate left unlatched, not to let go of what was, but to let in what could be." Caleb came up the trail at 9:30. Riding easy, hat pulled low against the morning glare, he dismounted at the post, looped his reins, and climbed the steps like a man who'd been invited to stay a while. "Mornin', mornin', coffee's hot." He sat, took the cup, drank. They didn't talk about fences. They didn't talk about Tom, or the weeks of struggle, or the morning Caleb rode up with 6 men and a loaded wagon. They talked about spring, whether the thaw might come early this year, whether Martha's 60 acres could carry a few head of cattle come April, whether the creek would run high enough to water them. Ordinary words, the quiet language of 2 people beginning something they didn't need to name. The sun moved slow across the valley. Shadows shortened. The snow caught the light and threw it back in sheets of white and gold, and the Rockies stood patient and enormous against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Martha held her cup in both hands. The cloth wrappings were thinner now. Healing had started. Caleb sat beside her, saying nothing, because some moments are too full for words. The sunset, when it came, painted the Rockies gold. Not the cold gold of winter light, but something warmer, something that looked like the color of a promise kept. Not by one woman alone, but by a woman brave enough to let somebody stand beside her. 2 coffee cups steaming in the February air. Gold light on white snow, a fence line running straight and true across 60 acres of land that Tom Yates built and Martha Yates saved. Not by holding on too tight, but by learning, finally, to open her hands. And the mountains, old as mercy, stood witness to the simplest truth the frontier ever taught. Accepting help ain't weakness. It's the bravest kind of trust.